Welcome back to Kids Church. Hello to those that are at church at Ryan's Road, and hello to those who are at church at home. It's so good to be able to learn about Jesus together from the book of Luke this term. We're going to be learning in our small groups with friends and family, together, or online, or on Zoom. If you asked a friend at school, who is Jesus? What would they say? Someone who lived a long time ago? Perhaps a good man, a remarkable man. Did you know many school children and adults are unable to answer this question because they haven't had the opportunity to read about Jesus in the Bible? But we can know who is Jesus because God has shown us Jesus in the Bible. And a doctor called Luke has carefully investigated and written this book so we can be sure of the truth about Jesus, and so we can be sure about believing in and following Jesus. So this term, we return to the book of Luke in the New Testament. Luke shows us Jesus teaching about God and God's kingdom. He shows us the people Jesus met, what Jesus thought was important, and the many miracles that Jesus could do because he had God's power. In the book of Luke, we have already seen God's angels declare the good news of God's Saviour Jesus being born to rescue all people to bring them close to God. John the Baptist, a prophet, that is a messenger from God, told God's people to get ready for Jesus to come. Jesus didn't sin when he was tested, and Jesus had God's power over nature, sickness, and even death. Jesus was the sin doctor. He came to forgive and call sinners to follow him. Jesus had authority to set things right. Huge crowds followed Jesus, wondering who Jesus was. They hadn't figured it out yet. The crowds thought that Jesus may be John the Baptist. That's the prophet who told people to get ready for the Christ. Some thought Jesus was one of the prophets, God's messengers, who told people what God wanted to say. Some thought he was one of the greatest prophets who lived hundreds of years before Christ. That is Elijah. One day, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you think I am?" His disciple Peter had figured it out and answered, "You are the Christ of God." Jesus is so much more than a prophet. He is the Christ that all the prophets in the Old Testament have been pointing to. Jesus the Christ is so much more than a prophet because the Christ is the King who God promised would rescue his people. God's people knew that he promised to send the Christ to rescue his people. They knew he would be born in Bethlehem, be descended from David, and bring in a new kingdom where he would rule forever. His people were eager to meet the Christ, but Jesus knew that people didn't understand what sort of king he was going to be. They thought Jesus was going to be like King David and defeat the Roman rulers and make Israel a strong nation again. In fact, they wanted to put Jesus on a horse and make him king. Perhaps his followers wanted to share in the ruling of his kingdom too. Jesus surprises and confuses people by teaching what is going to happen next to him. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man and says, "The Son of Man must suffer many things. He will be rejected by the Jewish elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the law. The Son of Man will be killed, but after 3 days he will be raised from death." How could Jesus be a king if he dies? Well, it's because Jesus' kingdom is not an earthly kingdom gained by conquering the Romans in battle. It's a heavenly kingdom. Jesus' heavenly kingdom is achieved by Jesus the King giving his life to pay the punishment for the sins of people who follow him. That is why Jesus came and died. It is a part of God's rescue plan. Ever since man sinned and the whole of creation was broken by sin, God promised that he would send a rescuer to save us from the power of sin so we can be part of his kingdom again. In fact, 700 years before Jesus was on earth, the prophet Isaiah clearly tells us that Christ would suffer, be rejected, be killed, and be raised. In Isaiah chapter 53, Isaiah says, "He was hated and rejected by people. He had much pain and suffering. People would not even look at him. He was hated, and we didn't even notice him. But he was wounded for the wrong things we did. He was crushed for the evil things we did. The punishment which made us well was given to him, and we are healed because of his wounds. For this reason, I will make him a great man among people. He will share in all things with those who are strong. He willingly gave his life. He was treated like a criminal, but he carried away the sins of many people, and he asked forgiveness for those who sinned." Jesus is the Christ, the King that God promised would rescue his people. Jesus rescued his people when he chose to suffer and die, even though he did not sin. Jesus took the punishment for my sin, the punishment that I deserve, and that punishment for sin is death. Jesus took the punishment for my sin so I didn't have to, and so I can now be forgiven by God. Jesus dying on the cross is the only way I can be saved to be a child in God's kingdom and a follower of Jesus. But that's not the end. Jesus is more powerful than death, and after 3 days, Jesus was raised from the dead and appeared to his disciples and 500 other people before he went to heaven. So the risen Jesus is now ruling as glorious King in heaven. One day, we will all see Jesus' glory when he returns to judge and bring people into his kingdom. God showed the disciples a glimpse of Jesus' glory. They saw Jesus' awesomeness and perfection. Up on a mountain, the disciples saw Jesus' clothing become white and bedazzled, and God announced, "This is my Son. He is the one I have chosen. Obey him." One day, we too will see Jesus' glory when he returns to judge and bring his people into his kingdom. So in today's passage from Luke, we will see that Jesus is the Christ, the King who God promised would rescue his people. Jesus the Christ rescued us from the power of sin and death. He died in our place to rescue us, so now we can be children in his kingdom and followers of Jesus. If you believe that Jesus is the King who has rescued you from sin and death, he invites you into God's kingdom as one of his children and followers. Do you want to be a follower of Jesus the King? Let's go to video 2 to read what God tells us about who Jesus is. Read along Luke chapter 9 on your worksheet.